You are sitting there again, watching someone explain something with absolute certainty, and for a moment you feel that familiar tension inside your chest. It happens in conversations, in debates, in documentaries, in comment sections, in family gatherings, in places of worship, in classrooms, and sometimes in the silence of your own thoughts. Someone presents an idea that is supposed to explain reality, suffering, morality, purpose, existence, or what happens after death. They speak confidently, they sound convinced, they sound sincere, and yet there comes a point where the explanation reaches a wall. Not a wall of intelligence, not a wall of education, not a wall of effort, a different wall, a wall where evidence stops, certainty continues, and something else takes over. You recognize the moment because you have experienced it yourself. Maybe you have defended an idea you desperately wanted to be true. Maybe you have questioned an idea you were told never to question. Maybe you have found yourself trapped between the comfort of certainty and the discomfort of honesty. Because there is a difference between saying I know and saying I trust. There is a difference between proof and conviction. And one of the most uncomfortable realizations a person can experience is discovering how often those two things become intertwined. Think about the moments in life that matter most, the moments when everything feels unstable, the death of someone you love, the collapse of a relationship, the diagnosis that changes everything, the sleepless nights when your future suddenly feels uncertain. Human beings do not merely seek information during those moments, they seek meaning. They seek something that can hold them together when logic alone feels cold and insufficient. This is where a fascinating psychological tension begins. Because the mind wants explanations, but the heart wants reassurance. The mind asks whether something is true. The heart asks whether it can survive without it. And sometimes those questions produce very different answers. That tension may be one of the oldest struggles in human history. We want certainty in a universe that rarely offers it. We want guarantees in a reality filled with risk. We want final answers in a world where most answers seem temporary. The uncomfortable question is not whether people believe things. Everyone does. The uncomfortable question is what happens when belief becomes responsible for carrying emotional burdens that evidence cannot carry by itself. Imagine a person standing on the edge of a profound uncertainty. Maybe they are confronting mortality. Maybe they are confronting injustice. Maybe they are confronting the apparent randomness of suffering. They ask why. They ask how. They ask what it all means. At first, they search for explanations. They read. They listen. They analyze. But eventually they reach a point where explanation alone cannot eliminate uncertainty. And then something remarkable often happens. The conversation shifts. It shifts from what can be demonstrated to what must be trusted. Not necessarily because someone is dishonest, not necessarily because someone is irrational, but because human beings are not machines. We do not experience reality as detached observers. We experience reality as emotional creatures who feel fear, hope, grief, longing, loneliness, and wonder. The deeper the question, the more likely emotion becomes involved. And once emotion becomes involved, the boundary between evidence and trust becomes much harder to see. That realization can be deeply unsettling because most people prefer clear categories. They want to know who is right and who is wrong, who is rational and who is irrational, who is objective and who is biased. But reality rarely cooperates with those categories. Consider how often people accuse others of relying on faith while remaining blind to the assumptions they themselves never question. One person places faith in a spiritual framework. Another places faith in human progress. Another places faith in scientific advancement, eventually solving humanity's greatest problems. Another places faith in moral intuitions. Another places faith in political systems. Another places faith in personal experience. The forms differ, but the psychological structure can look surprisingly similar. Human beings often build their lives upon foundations they cannot completely prove. That does not automatically make those foundations wrong. It simply reveals something profound about the human condition. We are finite creatures attempting to navigate an infinite amount of uncertainty. We cannot verify everything. We cannot investigate every assumption. We cannot personally confirm every claim that shapes our worldview. At some point, everyone reaches areas where trust enters the picture. Yet there is still a particular discomfort that emerges whenever a person realizes that an argument depends on faith at a critical moment. Why is that realization so powerful? Perhaps because many people secretly hope they can escape uncertainty entirely. They hope there exists a perspective that eliminates all doubt. They hope there exists a position that stands on an unshakable foundation. They hope there exists a final answer that requires no leap whatsoever. But life repeatedly confronts us with the possibility that uncertainty may not be a temporary obstacle. It may be a permanent feature of existence. That possibility terrifies people, not because they are weak, because they are human. Think about the conversations that become emotionally charged the fastest. They are usually not conversations about simple facts. They are conversations about meaning. Meaning touches identity. Identity touches belonging. Belonging touches survival. People can calmly discuss the weight of a rock or the temperature outside, but discussions about purpose, morality, existence, destiny, consciousness, or ultimate reality often become intensely personal because they threaten something deeper than information. They threaten the frameworks people use to understand themselves, and when a framework feels threatened, the brain often reacts as though the person themselves are under attack. Suddenly, the debate is no longer about an idea. It becomes about security. It becomes about fear. It becomes about what would happen if the foundation disappeared. Imagine discovering that a belief you relied upon for years contains unanswered questions. Maybe the belief is religious, maybe it is philosophical, maybe it is political, maybe it is personal. The details matter less than the experience itself. The experience is deeply unsettling because it creates cognitive dissonance. Part of you wants to protect the belief. Another part wants to examine it honestly. Part of you fears what you might find. Another part fears living with unanswered questions. You become trapped between competing desires. The desire for truth and the desire for comfort. The desire for certainty and the desire for intellectual honesty. Many people spend years living inside that tension. Some eventually embrace faith more consciously. Others move away from it. Others remain permanently uncertain. But what makes the journey so difficult is that uncertainty often feels emotionally unbearable. We rarely talk about that openly. We like to imagine ourselves as purely rational beings, following evidence wherever it leads. Yet when beliefs become connected to identity, family, culture, community, hope, grief, or purpose, the situation becomes infinitely more complicated. Suddenly changing your mind is not merely changing your opinion. It can feel like changing your entire relationship with reality. It can feel like losing a language you once used to understand the world. It can feel like stepping into darkness without knowing whether there is ground beneath your feet. That is why conversations about faith, doubt, and certainty are rarely just intellectual conversations. They are emotional experiences disguised as arguments. Behind every debate there may be hidden fears nobody mentions. Fear of meaninglessness, fear of isolation, fear of being wrong, fear of death, fear of regret, fear of discovering that reality is stranger than we imagined. And perhaps that is why the statement, "Nobody can defend this without appealing to faith," resonates so strongly. Not because it automatically proves anything, not because it automatically disproves anything, but because it forces us to confront a difficult possibility. It forces us to ask whether some of our deepest convictions rest upon foundations that cannot be completely demonstrated. It forces us to ask whether certainty sometimes exceeds evidence. It forces us to examine the role trust plays in our understanding of reality. Most people are comfortable questioning other people's assumptions. Far fewer are comfortable questioning their own. Yet genuine reflection begins precisely there. It begins when you stop asking why other people believe what they believe and start asking why you believe what you believe. It begins when you become curious about your own mind, about your own fears, about your own hopes, about the emotional needs that may influence your conclusions. That process can feel threatening because it removes the illusion that certainty is simple, but it can also be liberating. Because once you recognize the complexity of belief, you may become less interested in winning arguments and more interested in understanding yourself. You may become less obsessed with proving and more interested in exploring, less concerned with defending identity and more concerned with pursuing truth wherever it leads. And perhaps that is where the deepest realization waits, not at the end of certainty, but at the beginning of humility, the realization that human beings are navigating mysteries larger than themselves, the realization that confidence and truth are not always the same thing, the realization that doubt is not necessarily weakness and faith is not necessarily ignorance, the realization that uncertainty may be an unavoidable part of being conscious at all. And when you finally sit alone with that realization, without rushing to escape it, without immediately choosing a side, without desperately trying to silence the discomfort, you may discover something unexpected. The question was never merely whether an argument requires faith. The deeper question is why the possibility of needing faith of any kind makes us so uncomfortable in the first place. The discomfort becomes impossible to ignore the moment you realize that most people are not actually arguing about evidence. They believe they are. They insist they are. They may spend hours presenting facts, examples, interpretations, experiences, historical references, or philosophical arguments. But beneath all of that, something deeper is often taking place. Two people can look at the same reality and arrive at entirely different conclusions. Not because one is necessarily smarter or more informed, but because they are carrying different fears, different hopes, different emotional investments into the conversation. This realization can feel almost disturbing because it challenges the comforting idea that human beings are primarily logical creatures. Think about how often people change their minds after receiving new information. It happens sometimes, but not nearly as often as we like to imagine. More often, people absorb new information and immediately begin searching for ways to fit it into conclusions they already prefer. The mind is astonishingly creative when protecting beliefs that feel emotionally necessary. This is not a flaw unique to one ideology, one religion, one worldview, or one community. It appears to be a deeply human tendency. We all want reality to make sense. We all want our suffering to mean something. We all want our sacrifices to matter. We all want our lives to fit into a story larger than random events unfolding in an indifferent universe. And once a particular story begins providing that sense of meaning, questioning it can feel like threatening the entire structure holding a person's life together. Imagine someone who has endured enormous hardship, years of disappointment, loss, betrayal, loneliness, grief. Maybe they survived because they believed their pain had a purpose. Maybe they believed something meaningful was being accomplished through their suffering. Maybe they believed there was a destination that justified the journey. Now imagine someone challenging that framework. The challenge is not merely intellectual, it becomes emotional immediately. Because if the framework collapses, what happens to the meaning attached to those years of pain? What happens to the sacrifices? What happens to the hope that helped them survive? Suddenly the conversation is not about abstract ideas. It is about the emotional architecture of a human life. This is why discussions about faith often generate reactions that seem disproportionate to the topic itself. People are not merely protecting conclusions. They are protecting identities. They are protecting narratives. They are protecting the structures through which they interpret existence. And when those structures are questioned, something inside them feels exposed. Even people who pride themselves on skepticism are not immune. Skepticism itself can become part of an identity. Rationality can become part of an identity. Independence can become part of an identity. The human tendency remains remarkably consistent. We become attached not only to answers, but to the image of ourselves that those answers support. That attachment creates a fascinating paradox. Most people claim they want truth above all else, yet if truth threatens a deeply valued identity, the situation becomes much more complicated. The fear is often not that a specific belief might be false. The fear is what losing that belief would mean. Who would you become without it? How would you explain your life? How would you interpret your past? How would you face your future? These questions reach into places that logic alone cannot easily touch. There is another layer to this that many people never fully examine. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We do not simply observe events, we create narratives around them. A coincidence becomes a sign, a tragedy becomes a lesson, a success becomes validation, a failure becomes a warning. We constantly weave experiences into stories because stories help us navigate uncertainty. They transform chaos into coherence. They allow us to feel that our lives possess direction rather than randomness. But every story contains assumptions. Every narrative rests on interpretations that extend beyond raw facts. And eventually we encounter questions where facts alone seem incapable of providing complete answers. Why are we here? What is consciousness? Why does suffering exist? Is morality something discovered or created? What happens when we die? Why does beauty move us? Why does love feel significant? Why do human beings long for meaning with such intensity? At that point, something interesting happens. Evidence may illuminate part of the landscape, but it rarely eliminates all mystery. There remains a gap. Some people view that gap as an invitation to faith. Others view it as a reason for caution. Others view it as proof that certainty is impossible. Yet regardless of the conclusion, the gap remains. That gap is where countless arguments begin. One person says the gap points towards something transcendent. Another says the gap simply reflects the limits of current knowledge. Another says the question itself may be flawed. The debate continues generation after generation because the gap refuses to disappear. What often goes unnoticed is how much emotion becomes invested in the outcome. People do not merely want answers, they want certain answers. They want answers capable of silencing uncertainty permanently. But reality rarely cooperates with that desire. In fact, one of the most uncomfortable truths about existence may be that uncertainty cannot be eliminated entirely. It can be reduced, it can be managed, it can be explored, but it may never disappear. The human mind struggles with this possibility because uncertainty feels vulnerable. It feels unstable, it feels unsafe. We crave solid ground, we crave finality, we crave conclusions that allow us to stop searching. Yet many of life's deepest questions refuse to provide that kind of closure. Consider how often people assume certainty is a sign of strength. Someone speaks confidently, and others interpret confidence as evidence of knowledge. Yet confidence and accuracy are not the same thing. History is filled with confident people who were mistaken. It is also filled with uncertain people who recognized complexities others ignored. Certainty feels attractive because it offers psychological relief. It reduces anxiety. It simplifies decision-making. It creates a sense of control. But psychological relief and objective truth are not identical. Sometimes certainty emerges because a conclusion is well supported. Other times certainty emerges because doubt has become emotionally intolerable. Distinguishing between those situations requires a level of self-awareness many people never develop, because it demands asking questions we would rather avoid. Am I convinced because the evidence is overwhelming, or because the alternative frightens me? Am I defending an idea because it is true, or because it protects something emotionally important? Am I pursuing understanding, or am I protecting identity? These questions can feel deeply uncomfortable, because they expose motivations we often prefer not to see. Yet they also reveal something profoundly human. Every person lives within a tension between truth and comfort. Every person must navigate the relationship between evidence and meaning. Every person encounters situations where certainty becomes tempting precisely because uncertainty feels painful. The challenge is not simply intellectual, it is emotional, it is existential. It is deeply personal. And perhaps this explains why some conversations never seem to reach resolution. Participants believe they are debating conclusions, while beneath the surface they are negotiating fears. One person fears meaninglessness, another fears self-deception. One fears abandoning hope, another fears accepting comforting illusions. One fears uncertainty, another fears false certainty. The arguments sound different, but the emotional currents driving them often share surprising similarities. There is a strange loneliness that can emerge when someone begins recognizing these patterns. They start noticing how often people speak as though their conclusions are inevitable when in reality, assumptions are hiding beneath the surface. They begin noticing how frequently, emotional needs shape intellectual positions. They begin noticing the invisible role trust plays in human thought, and once you see it, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. You notice it in institutions, you notice it in communities, you notice it in public debates. Most unsettling of all, you notice it in yourself. You realize that your own mind is not a perfectly objective machine. You realize that your desires, fears, experiences, and hopes influence the way you interpret reality. This realization can feel threatening at first because it undermines the fantasy of complete objectivity. But it can also produce humility. It can create space for curiosity. It can reduce the need to treat every disagreement as a battle between intelligence and ignorance. Because once you understand how deeply human psychology shapes belief, you become less interested in simplistic explanations. You become more interested in the complexity of being human. And perhaps that complexity is the real issue hiding beneath the surface of the statement, "Nobody can defend this," without appealing to faith. The statement is not merely about arguments. It is about the human longing for foundations strong enough to carry the weight of existence. It is about the fear that those foundations may contain elements that cannot be completely proven. It is about the possibility that certainty itself may sometimes rest upon assumptions we rarely acknowledge. And if that possibility is true, then the challenge is no longer identifying who relies on faith. The challenge becomes recognizing where faith, trust, assumption, hope, and uncertainty intersect within every attempt to make sense of reality. That realization does not necessarily provide answers. In some ways, it creates even more questions. But it also invites something many people spend their entire lives avoiding: a willingness to sit with uncertainty without immediately rushing to escape it, a willingness to examine the foundations beneath our convictions, a willingness to admit that some of the most important questions in existence may not yield simple resolutions. And in that space, where certainty loosens its grip and curiosity takes its place, an entirely different kind of understanding begins to emerge. Eventually you arrive at a moment that feels strangely quiet, not because all the questions have been answered, not because all the contradictions have disappeared, not because uncertainty has finally been defeated. The silence comes from something else. It comes from realizing that the battle you thought was happening outside of you has been happening inside you the entire time. For years, perhaps decades, you may have looked at arguments as contests between opposing sides. One group defending one worldview, another group defending another, one claiming certainty, another challenging it, one appealing to faith, another demanding evidence. Yet beneath the endless debates, beneath the books, speeches, discussions, and disagreements, there exists a more personal confrontation, a confrontation between your desire for certainty and your encounter with mystery. Because no matter how sophisticated a person's worldview becomes, no matter how carefully constructed their philosophy appears, no matter how confident their conclusions sound, there comes a point where reality extends beyond complete comprehension. Human beings can learn extraordinary things. We can investigate nature, explore consciousness, examine history, analyze behavior, and expand knowledge in remarkable ways. Yet the deeper we look, the more we often encounter questions that refuse to disappear. Questions about existence itself, questions about meaning, questions about why there is something rather than nothing, questions about whether purpose is discovered or created, questions about whether consciousness is merely an accident of matter or something more profound, questions about whether moral values are objective realities or human constructions, questions about death, suffering, beauty, love, and the strange ache for significance that seems woven into human experience. What makes these questions so powerful is not merely their difficulty, it is the fact that they touch every human life. Nobody escapes them entirely. Even people who claim not to care about philosophy often reveal philosophical assumptions through the way they live. Even people who reject certain forms of faith often place trust in other frameworks for understanding reality. Even people who celebrate uncertainty often carry hidden convictions about what uncertainty means. This does not imply that all beliefs are identical or equally justified. It simply reveals that human beings cannot avoid interpreting reality. We cannot stand completely outside our own existence and examine it from a perfectly neutral position. We are participants within the mystery we are attempting to understand, and perhaps that is where the deepest discomfort begins, because many of us secretly hope for a viewpoint that transcends all limitations. We want an answer that removes ambiguity forever. We want a perspective so complete that doubt becomes unnecessary. But the human condition may not allow that kind of certainty. The mind resists this possibility because certainty feels safe. Certainty feels like arriving home after wandering through darkness. It feels like finally reaching solid ground. Yet what if some of the most important aspects of existence are not structured in a way that permits absolute closure? What if part of maturity involves learning how to live without the guarantees we desperately crave? This is where the psychological dimension becomes impossible to ignore. People often imagine that faith and doubt are opposites, but lived experience suggests something more complicated. Some of the most faithful individuals wrestle with profound doubt. Some of the most skeptical individuals possess deep convictions they rarely question. The boundary between certainty and uncertainty is rarely as clean as it appears from a distance. In fact, many people move back and forth between the two throughout their lives. They experience moments of confidence, followed by periods of questioning. They experience conviction, followed by confusion. They experience clarity, followed by mystery. This movement can feel frustrating because it refuses to provide permanent stability. Yet it may also reveal something important about what it means to be human. Perhaps growth does not always occur through eliminating uncertainty. Perhaps growth sometimes occurs through developing a healthier relationship with it. Think about how much energy people spend trying to escape uncertainty. They seek definitive answers to questions that may not possess definitive answers. They seek guarantees about the future. They seek protection from ambiguity. They seek intellectual systems capable of explaining every aspect of existence. When those systems encounter limitations, frustration emerges, anxiety emerges, fear emerges. But there is another possibility, a possibility that many people resist because it sounds unsatisfying at first, the possibility that uncertainty is not always an enemy. The possibility that mystery is not always a defect in understanding. The possibility that some questions are valuable precisely because they remain open. This does not mean abandoning reason. It does not mean rejecting evidence. It does not mean accepting every claim uncritically. Rather, it means recognizing the difference between seeking understanding and demanding absolute certainty. One pursuit expands awareness. The other can become an endless struggle against the limits of human knowledge. The statement "nobody can defend this without appealing to faith" becomes especially interesting when viewed through this lens. Because the statement often carries an accusation. It suggests weakness. It suggests inadequacy. It suggests that an argument somehow fails because trust enters the picture. Yet the deeper question may not be whether faith appears. The deeper question is what role faith plays and whether we are willing to acknowledge its presence honestly. Every person trusts something. Every person operates from assumptions. Every person builds their life upon foundations they did not personally verify from the ground up. The issue is not whether assumptions exist. The issue is whether we recognize them, whether we examine them, whether we remain open to revising them, whether we understand the emotional forces attached to them. This is where humility becomes so important, not the humility of pretending all ideas are equally convincing, not the humility of refusing to make judgments, but the humility of recognizing that human beings are limited creatures, attempting to understand realities that may exceed complete comprehension. That humility can transform the entire conversation. Instead of asking who possesses absolute certainty, we begin asking better questions. What experiences shaped this belief? What fears influence this conclusion? What assumptions support this framework? What emotional needs might be involved? What evidence exists? What remains uncertain? These questions create space for reflection rather than tribal conflict. They create space for exploration rather than defensiveness. They create space for understanding rather than mere victory. And perhaps that is what many people are truly searching for beneath the arguments. Not merely answers, but understanding. Not merely certainty, but meaning. Not merely conclusions, but wisdom, because wisdom often begins where certainty becomes less important than honesty. The honesty to admit what we know, the honesty to admit what we do not know, the honesty to recognize where evidence ends and interpretation begins, the honesty to acknowledge the emotional dimensions of belief without reducing everything to emotion, the honesty to confront our own vulnerabilities rather than projecting them onto others. That kind of honesty is difficult because it strips away comforting illusions. It removes the fantasy that we stand completely outside the human condition. It forces us to recognize ourselves within the very questions we are examining. We are not spectators, observing uncertainty from a safe distance. We are participants, living inside it. And perhaps that is why these conversations continue generation after generation. Not because humanity is failing to solve a problem, but because humanity is repeatedly encountering the same profound realities: mortality, meaning, purpose, suffering, love, consciousness, hope, fear, wonder. These realities refuse to become irrelevant because they are woven into the experience of being alive. Every generation asks the questions again. Every generation develops new arguments. Every generation searches for certainty. Yet the mystery remains, not necessarily because answers do not exist, but because human understanding remains partial. And in that realization, there is something both unsettling and strangely freeing. Unsettling because it means some uncertainty may always remain. Freeing because it means you no longer have to pretend certainty is complete when it is not. You no longer have to fear every unanswered question. You no longer have to treat doubt as a catastrophe or conviction as invincibility. You can simply acknowledge the complexity of existence and continue exploring it with honesty. When you reach that point, the statement "nobody can defend this without appealing to faith" changes meaning entirely. It stops being a weapon. It stops being a slogan. It stops being a final verdict. Instead, it becomes an invitation to examine how human beings construct meaning in the face of uncertainty. It becomes an invitation to reflect on the relationship between evidence, trust, hope, fear, and identity. It becomes an invitation to investigate not only the ideas we defend, but the reasons we need to defend them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of all is that the search was never only about finding the right answer. It was also about understanding the person searching for it, the beliefs, fears, desires, wounds, hopes, and questions that shape every attempt to make sense of reality. Because long after the arguments end, long after the debates fade, long after certainty rises and falls, one challenge remains. The challenge of looking honestly at yourself and asking whether you are pursuing truth, protecting comfort, or trying to navigate the fragile space between the two.